Brussell in Carmel, California. Tape number 393, side 1, June the 15th, 1979. It is not very often that we get together on these tapes through the years that I can begin the show with such joyful news, such gleeful smile on my face. It was a very important week in terms of two important people dying, and I'm not referring to Jack Haley or John Wayne. I'm referring to General Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence of the Eastern Division, and Ferenc, the former premier of Hungary. Many of you who read the newspapers every day and are up on the news, listen to TV and radio, I've spoken to several of you on the telephone, and it came as a complete surprise in your newspapers that you didn't even have information about these two important men. But the people that take these tapes and have heard me on the radio for the past 8 years know the significance that I place to these men and the articles I've written, particularly about Gehlen. But Ferenc Nagy died Monday or Tuesday. It's hard to tell. The newspaper article out here, a small article, was in the Monterey Herald. It was Associated Press story, June the 12th. Ferenc Nagy, former premier of Hungary, died a heart attack. He was 75 years old. The news about General Reinhard Gehlen came over radio here on the West Coast. Saturday night about 12 o'clock, the 12 o'clock news mentioned Reinhard Gehlen died. I have yet to see any single article in my newspapers about Reinhard Gehlen. Maybe my New York Times, when it comes, will have an obituary. They do a pretty good job of that, but I don't see anything about Gehlen. I want to talk about Nagy and Gehlen and the legacy they left to us, the importance of these men. They shaped the entire history for the next hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. Their machinery, their intelligence machinery from Germany, from Hitler's Gestapo that set up the American CIA, has affected almost every event that we see in the news today. There was a book review in 1974 that seems like a long way back. It was, strangely enough, or not very strangely, in American opinion, and it was about a book that came out at the time on the Lusitania. And this book was about Colin Simpson's story of the Lusitania. And the book review, which I saved because it's so important to lessons of history, which some people are trying to study now, tells about the continuity of the Lusitania to the future of the United States. And the reviewer said that Colin Simpson started to study the history of the Lusitania, the ship that was sunk during World War I, and when he wanted to obtain the passenger manifest, there were 3 discrepant manifests that he didn't get a hold of. And the problem was, who has the original? Where's the original? And then the next subject goes into the Pearl Harbor, bombings of Pearl Harbor. And there are new books out and new documents that Franklin Roosevelt and the American Defense Department knew in advance that there was going to be the bombings of Pearl Harbor, just as they knew about the sinking of the Lusitania. So 32 years later, there was the Pearl Harbor, and it's been 32 years, the review said, since Pearl Harbor, when this was written. But it was 26 years from the submarine attack that drowned the Americans and other persons on the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. And the reviewer asked, why should one feel that what happened to the Lusitania is one of those old, far-off things, while the secret of Pearl Harbor or the Kennedy assassination, now 10 years old, so this was written 5 years ago, is an unresolved controversy still on the docket? The answer is that all these matters are still on the docket. History is not a succession of discrete events. I'm reading from this book review on the Lusitania. History is not a succession of discrete events, but a tapestry woven of many strands in which motifs and typecast characters appear and reappear, in which plots and subplots are interfaced. The Lusitania is interesting, not because of Pearl Harbor or the Kennedy assassination, but because of the things to come. History does have a plot to unravel, The world is bewildering, most bewildering of all to those who study it the most. The world is terrifying, especially those who have the courage to face it. The consolation for all of this, the studying of history, is that nothing is without meaning, whether we explain it or not. The Lusitania stratagem got us into World War I. The Pearl Harbor stratagem got us into another war. And our conflicting American commitments in the Middle East, oil with Israel, will get us into the Third World War. The men that planned the Kennedy assassination are hell-bent on the Third World War. And he asked the question, was the Lusitania sacrificed to advance that war? Was Pearl Harbor sacrificed to advance next war? And of course, Kennedy was sacrificed to advance the next war. I thought this was an interesting review, and I got it out from my files to share with you because even though it was published in 1974, the fruits of the planning of the murders of Kennedy directly linked to these two dogs that died this week, Ferenc Nagy and Reinhard Gehlen, and they link to the roots of World War III, which we're on the verge of facing right now. Now, Ferenc Nagy was, as I say, the former premier of Hungary. He was ousted in 1947 when there was a takeover. In a book, The History of the Cold War by André Fontaine, it describes how Hungary was the weakest link in the chain that Khrushchev took after World War II, and that there was a rebellion formed. And the brother of Ferenc Nagy, his name was Imre Nagy, was executed for high treason, mutiny, plotting against the Russians, starting plots to overthrow the People's Republic. The two brothers, Ferenc and Imre, were both active in trying to overthrow the Soviets in Hungary after the war. And they were Cold War agents. They became part of Hitler's intelligence, Ferenc Nagy and his cohorts. They lined up with Reinhard Gehlen and became part of the Gehlen operation, the organization. Our CIA was formed in 1947, and Imre Nagy was killed when the government was toppled in 1947. But his brother, Ferenc, came to the United States and worked with J. Edgar Hoover, and he's written up extensively in the Torbit document. That is the manuscript on the assassination of John Kennedy. Many of you have it, and if you don't have it, I'll give the address one more time of where you can get the Torbit document with information about Ferenc Nagy. He was a spy. Written in the book, The General Was a Spy, and I'm giving you that title too on this sheet. There's a book, The General Was a Spy, The Truth About General Gehlen, 20th Century Super Spy Who Served Hitler, the CIA, and West Germany. Gehlen used Nagy, he used Ferenc Nagy, and in 1947 the Gehlen organization was well into its job of setting up the Cold War against the Soviet Union. In this book there's quotations. Hungary became increasingly important in the Gehlen scheme of things. As early as 1947, Gehlen confided that he was reckoning on the possibility of a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And if there were an armed conflict, the Russians and Americans would tear each other to pieces, and it would leave a rearmed Germany to create the new order. That's why we have such warmongers as General Haig and the Schlesingers, the Dornbergers, the Walter Dornberger, who ran Bell Aerospace, working with Reinhard Gehlen, Werner von Braun, and Henry Kissinger from Germany, Mr. Brzezinski from Poland. These Germans that have taken over our National Security Council since 1947 were part of that Gehlen organization. Gehlen, according to this book, The General Was a Spy, was given decisive influence on American foreign policy. Ever since the war, the U.S. War Department commissioned him for intelligence work in the East. And this book goes on to say that he kept giving the vision that Russia would take over the world, move all the way to the end of Europe, take all of Europe, and he kept the Cold War going, which he delighted in doing. And of course this book says that his picture of Russia was a totally false one. But in the meantime, the German economy is sound, America is bankrupt, and in keeping us afraid of Russia, the Cold War policy of Reinhard Gehlen has absolutely worked. There was a long article about Nagy in the Washington Post, and I'm giving you this date too in case any of you want to look it up. This article says he came to the United States in 1947, and he earned money lecturing, writing. He bought a 12-room farmhouse, a 130-acre dairy farm. He gave up farming because he found himself drawn toward political activity with other exiled Hungarians. He also worked with exiled Russians and Poles and persons who had fled from the Tsar's regime, and he was very deep into counterintelligence. He received a large amount of money from J. Edgar Hoover for counterintelligence. He has 5 children living in the United States. One is an electronic engineer in Massachusetts, Bedford, Massachusetts. One is working for an engineer placement firm in New Hampshire. One is a court reporter. Now, in the Torba document, for those that who don't have it, I might briefly run down a few points about Permindex, that Swiss corporation, the five-front organization that was behind the attempted killing of Charles de Gaulle that I mentioned last week, and also behind the killings of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the many assassinations that are still going on today. The five-prong group involved, one, the Solidarists, which was the exile group that Ferenc Nagy organized and worked with John de Menil down in New Orleans. That's Schlumberger, the firm of Schlumberger, that's so big and powerful right now. And he worked with the Tsarist Russians, the East Europeans, and Ferenc Nagy headed that group. And then the security division, a second part of this five-prong assassination team network, was headed by Wernher von Braun, the Nazi rocket specialist. And that was the division worked with Clay Shaw in New Orleans at the World Trade Mart, Guy Bannister worked with Robert Mayu in the assassination teams in the FBI. He worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans, and David Ferry, Jack Ruby, and Lee Harvey Oswald. The Gehlen group set up the security division with Wernher von Braun of the Aeronautics and Space, the NASA, and they set up the Solidarists, so that 2 of the 5 prongs of the killings that have gone on through the whole era since World War II were set up by Reinhard Gehlen and Ferenc Nagy. That's how important they were to the shape of American history. Gehlen is described in the Torba document as sending the Nazi rocket scientists to the United States, the men that worked with Hitler's intelligence, to set up the Solidarists, the Vaslov Army, and that's the group that I came upon when I was studying who Lee and Marina Oswald were living with and who was bringing them clothes and baby furniture and taking them to the dentist and the doctors and so forth. Gehlen developed a network, and the cover in Germany was the Economic Association for the Development of South Germany, and that is the group that sent spies, Nazi spies, all over the world, former members of the Gestapo, under the front of the Economic Association for the Development of South Germany. Gehlen and his specialists infiltrated Eastern Europe, the European states, and brought over people like Marina Oswald and even the Sirhan family through the Greek Orthodox Church, coming out of Palestine and flying them to Pasadena. The Hungarian Prime Minister, Ferenc Nagy, is described in the Torba document. The biography seems to overlap the Washington Post somewhat, but adds a little more. That in June 1945 he went to the United States and got permission from the United States Army to return $52 million in gold that was taken from Hungary by Adolf Hitler. He spent time down in Knoxville, Tennessee, and Huntsville and Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and he met the Nazi scientists there, and he went to the Redstone Arsenal in Tennessee Valley and worked with the Nazis that were setting up NASA, and also with Albert Osborne, who accompanied Lee Harvey Oswald to Mexico, where they met these schools, trained assassins. The biography in Torba document says in May 28, 1947, Nagy resigned from his post in Basel, Switzerland, and in the fall of 47, his family settled on that 120-acre farm that's described in the Washington Post, where he became an agent for, in quotes, communist-speaking engagements, anti-communist speaking engagements for the FBI. In the fall of 1947 to 1951, he started working closely with H.L. Hunt, In 1951, he was president of the Central Eastern European Committee for Refugees and Exiles. 1956 to 1962, up to the year before Kennedy was killed, he was president of the board of directors of Permandex, with their headquarters in Montreal and also in Switzerland and in Italy. This was a group of Nazi industrialists that were planning these murders and assassinations since World War II was over. In the spring of '63, Nagy settled in Dallas, Texas, on the 600 block of Fort Worth Avenue, 10 blocks from the Texas School Book Depository. Also on the 600 block was Ralph Paul, Jack Ruby's friend, and C.A. Pappy Dolson and Jack Ruby. They lived near him. He had relatives at 1024 Magellan Circle, Apartment D in Dallas, Texas, and right next door to Nagy, according to the Torbert document, lived Sylvia Odio, where one of the Lee Harvey Oswald doubles, William Seymour, was visiting in September of 1962, when Lee Harvey Oswald was actually down in Mexico. In the 600 block, 7 blocks from the city Lincoln Mercury, is where a man was impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald, who was trying to buy a car and leave incriminating evidence about his being a communist. The Torbert document alleges that Nagy appears in 35 different pictures at the assassination site when John Kennedy was killed, that he was photographed by bystanders, but the former Prime Minister of Hungary has never been called as a witness, not only before the Warren Commission, but certainly this last committee. The Torbert document came out before Blakey's committee, but I telephoned Gerard Blakey and said, "Do you have the Torbert document, you remember?" And he said, "I won't tell you," and he refused to receive it. Werner von Braun, of course, worked very closely with Ferenc, Nagy, and Albert Osborne, and von Braun was sent over by Gehlen, and the Nazification of NASA took place through the Gehlen agents down in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, under the Nazi leader of Werner von Braun. And in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the companion of Werner von Braun for the rockets was Walter Dornberger, the head of Bell Aerospace, one of the heads of Bell Aerospace, where Michael Payne worked, and that is the host of Lee and Marina Oswald. Marina stayed, Lee stayed at their home. The Dornberger von Braun links were very close to the assassination and documented in the Torbert document, but there's never been any discussion of researchers on checking out the Nagy address in the Dallas area and his links to the car agency or to Sylvia Odio and his role in the assassination. The legacy of Reinhard Gehlen, I could do a lifetime of tapes on that. Many of you who know me well know how I feel about Gehlen, and I'm always surprised when I speak to some researchers and talk about the Gehlen operation, and there's a question, what? And they're not aware of him. There are many books on Reinhard Gehlen. I'm giving you the name of 3. He's mentioned in many, many books. Gehlen, Spy of the Century, is terribly important. E.H. Cookreach. The one, The Service, The Memoirs of Reinhard Gehlen. And then there's another one, The General Was a Spy, that I quoted before. Those are just 3 books on Gehlen alone, but there are many, many books on Reinhard Gehlen. The legacy that Gehlen gives us is spelled out in The Spy of the Century. His intention, the minute he won the war, to kill 50 million people in the Ukraine. That genocide is in our newspapers today. It is in the book Alternative 3. It is the legacy of Gehlen to get rid of 40 million and make them slaves, take 50 million and kill them. What is happening to the American Indians? They're almost non-existent. Their water is being cut off. Their pine trees are being sprayed with chemicals. The children are adopted by the Mormons and taken away except for the summer months. Alcohol is poured into the reservations. The American Indians are going to be wiped out, just as the Jews in Poland have been wiped out. If there's 5,000 families in Poland now, there are going to be very few American Indians when the Gehlen operation really takes over the United States, which it's doing a very good job of doing right now. The articles on Jonestown are genocidal. I believe that the plans to kill these people was arranged a long time ago. This was confirmed just last week in the Chicago Sun, an article by Grace Stone, or quoting her, that is talked about the electrode beatings, the tortures, the 276 children killed in Jonestown, And she goes on to say, and another informer said that they knew before they were ever sent to Jonestown that everyone there was going to be killed, and that members of the Congress also knew they were going to be killed. Remember, Jim Jones said the CIA has control of my brain. There's another article about genocide and the legacy these Nazis left us. It's from a newsletter in Ireland, and I'm going to give you the address of Ed Sanders. It quotes some research that Ed Sanders is doing on cattle mutilations, and they've now linked these through autopsies of these cattle mutilations that have been going on, escalated since 1973, but started in 1961, to enzymes that take out a particular race, and they're finding that these cattle have Clostridia genus, it's called, a bacteria, and toxin in the bodies, and that the links to Dugway Proving Ground seem to go back to the time when Richard Nixon ordered the testing and the keeping of these toxins destroyed in 1970, and the Army went against his orders and moved them out and kept them. And some of the chemicals that they kept were these Clostridia genus, which were for the purpose of wiping out entire races. And Ed Sanders claims that the Army Dugway Proving Ground not only killed those sheep, but that they're responsible with helicopters, Vietnam-type helicopters close to the ground and silent, that are killing the cattle from, first they started in Kansas and Texas and up in Minnesota. It was in Minnesota where the case first began to break, and they began to do autopsies, and the veterinarians in Salt Lake and other places have been told to shut up and not to talk about it. But they're finding that this chemical is in these cows that have had the genitals and the tongues cut off, and they have removed the pregnant fetus from some of the cows, and the explanation is that they're testing chemical genocide on various people in different climates and different areas, such as hot, cold, anywhere from Minnesota down to Texas, under different circumstances, and they can't experiment on humans now, so they're using these cattle. But then they're cutting off the tails, slicing them surgically, which has been confirmed by Mr. Valle, who's done work on UFOs, that these are man-made dissections of specific persons, and they're using it for terror to make you afraid of UFOs or to link it to the occult. Ed Sanders wrote the book The Family, and years ago I objected to his book because his research was terrible, and he was trying to fall for the cover story of the occult that was behind the killing of the LaBiancas and the persons at Sharon Tate's home, and blame Charles Manson for the links of the occult to these massacres. But now Ed Sanders is smarter, and he's saying that they're trying to link the occult to the animal killings, and he's catching on that that's a cover story. But the important thing is that he claims that these chemicals were taken to the Army Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. Now, the man who was in charge of the Army Dugway Proving Grounds in that time was in 1973, when this Clostridia genus was removed there and they're testing it on these animals, was none other than Dr. Lawrence Layton, who I've talked about on my tapes on Jonestown, who was in charge of chemical biological warfare at Dugway, Utah. Now, it was his family that funded the money for Jonestown, the hundreds of thousands of dollars. In 1973, the same year that the animal mutilations were escalating and the chemicals were in Utah, in that same year was when the land was leased at Jonestown. And Gray Stone is saying they arrived knowing they were going to be killed. These people were put into little booths or shells of rooms and locked up and had arm and leg tags on them. So the legacy of genocide, of planned wiping out whole races, of biological warfare, began when Gehlen sent his people and his ideas to form our Central Intelligence Agency in 1947, when all of Hitler's chief of intelligence, East, West, you name it, came to the United States and formed the CIA and formed the National Security Council. And I've talked about that before. That took away the checks and balances of our Constitution, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. They told us what is national security. Security for them was to make war with Russia, which really meant weaken the United States. That's why we didn't need Kissinger, Brzezinski, foreign-born Russian people, refugees from the Tsarist Russia, Germans, Poles, the de Mohrenschildt types. We don't need them running our country, getting involved in our assassinations. But the point is that the National Security Council sends information to the president. The security of the United States depends upon this, such as John Kennedy was told the security depends upon the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy caught on that it didn't. There's a new book coming out, reviewed this week, about the Bay of Pigs almost starting World War III, and that they were sending troops down from Alabama, again, an area that von Braun and NASA controls very much. But just this week in the news was the article of Jonestown that they were sent down there and knew in advance that these 900 plus people would be killed. The newsletter of Ed Sanders, which I cross-filed this week on the toxins for racial genocide to wipe out whole genocides, the fact that these toxins were kept at Army Dugway Proving Ground by the very man, Dr. Layton, who financed and organized and whose son-in-law helped set up Jonestown. All of this is too much to ignore. The Dugway Proving Grounds with their genocidal chemicals, the intent of Reinhard Gehlen for starving 50 million or experimenting on making 40 million slaves. See, that goes into the mind control, and Dr. Delgado, and the use of controlling our minds to make us slaves, the 40 million to keep us happy. That is the legacy of that dog that died last week. Gehlen let a lot of legacies behind him. He left behind him. Another article this last week in the Washington Post was June the 3rd. Documents reveal who aided Idi Amin regime, and it goes into a Paris-based firm, the Intercontinental Technology, run by an American, Frank Turpil. He boasted he worked for the CIA, and he sold Amin $3.2 million worth of equipment, and Americans played a very big part in the weapons, the torture, the training of the torture, the professional killers. In the documents on who aided Amin, not only the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is funded by the CIA, but the United States CIA, France, trained his armies. They trained them, the Israelis and West Germans. Amin was trained by the Central Intelligence Agency in intelligence, sabotage, murder of prisoners, torture. He was provided with weapons, surveillance, and a wide variety of explosives that came from a man, Frank Turpil, who was very open that he supplied this for Amin. British firms were the biggest suppliers of communication equipment in Uganda. They went to England, to Cambridge, to a firm for special training. I get so mad when they point out to that great big black guy and make him the fall guy, or Hitler the fall guy. The answer is that these men were set up to torture, and now that Amin's out, it's a very strategic land, Central and Africa, with coffee, water, agriculture, and it'll be back in the hands of people that can control the heads of state. But the torture that Amin did was funded by the United States, by the British, by other countries, and the electronic equipment, the surveillance, the weapons, everything he did, they trained and helped him do. And I just hate to see fall guys when there's so much responsibility across the board. The article this week on documents reveal who aided Idi Amin regime. The more of Gehlen's legacy. Another article, Operation Candor, June the 4th this week. Operation Candor, U.S. is financing torture. The Drug Enforcement Agency spent $12 million down in Mexico to, in quotes, help fight narcotics. The federal officials go out of the room when the interrogations take place. One man had his legs amputated, prisoners disappear, others die. The American agents only give $12 million to the operation, but then they say they have no evidence of torture because they leave the room. In quotes, we haven't witnessed interrogations. We leave before they take place. Nobody suggested that we're involved in brutality. Operation Candor has reduced the flow of heroin, and the $12 million we sent down there is given to the Mexicans to do whatever they want to the people. Now what they do is simply torture them, kill them, take the operation, and then the heroin and the cocaine and the marijuana comes in through CIA agents or members like the Houston police that flew down to Colombia. High government officials are involved in narcotics operations, but they use the money to torture the lower level market and take over the market for themselves. There isn't a release in the flow of narcotics in the United States. It's just that we send money down to torture people at the lower level and take over the operations for the very highest up, I suppose, that there is in this government. And because the money for Jonestown, a great deal of it came from Germany up to the time that Jim Jones died, the legacy of those people has to be traced to Germany and to an intelligence operation that started, that colonial dignitad that was down in Chile that I did tapes on, is a Gehlen legacy. The overthrow of Allende was a Gehlen legacy. Henry Kissinger is a member of the Gehlen operation. Reinhard Gehlen left a legacy of murders, assassinations, genocide, torture, Cold War, lies, mistrust, deception, brain surgery, surveillance. He changed the whole shade of America, and as the book about Gehlen says, the one book, right on the cover, it says, "From the bunker of Adolf Hitler to the CIA." Those of you who are familiar with my sense of humor, if you can call it that, and with the music of Elton John, will recognize the music I decided to use to open and close the tape this week. It's Elton John's song "Funeral for a Friend," a contradiction, but I guess I was so glad to see the earth relieved of people like Gehlen because of the important role he had that I chose to use that music. I don't want somebody to hear it who knows the song and think, hey, that's a contradiction. It was done on purpose. I also want to talk about Gehlen and Watergate, and as I say, he's been important in everything, every bit of research I've done, and I came across him through the back door, first reading Volume 10 of the Warren Commission hearings of George de Mohrenschild's testimony pertaining to his knowledge of Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald. And that was when I realized that the Kennedy assassination was much bigger than just killing John Kennedy. And it had something to do with a whole world picture. When I read the de Mohrenschildt testimony and the way he talked and what he had done and where he had been, I knew that I had to study simultaneously American history and world history. It wasn't enough to read the Warren Commission hearings and be cross-filing those, that this was a broad tapestry. As I said in the beginning of this tape, it has to do with Pearl Harbor, the Lusitania, World War I, World War II, and Gehlen was beginning his reorganization of Hitler's intelligence the minute World War I was over. He was setting up his spy operation, planning a way to help Adolf Hitler conquer the world, and his history, his name is a tapestry. His agents weave through everything from Chappaquiddick to the Wallace shooting, to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and all the witnesses, and many of the killings and massacres that are going on today. The network was set up by Reinhard Gehlen. Truly a genius for deception, but I believe consistently that if you can take that kind of man and create something so diabolical and put it together that a person of equal intelligence can counteract that activity and expose it. The only difference between Mae Brussell and Reinhard Gehlen is that I don't have the money that he has, the millions and millions, 200 million plus from Allen Dulles by 71. Maybe he had 400, maybe he had $1,000 million to spend on his network to do the damage that he did. And yet individual researchers dig into their pockets, try to expose this man and how he got his money, and more important, the deals that he made with it that hurt other people's lives. This week is the anniversary of Watergate. It'll be 7 years and 2 days that the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. It was immediately that I recognized those persons as being involved in the Kennedy assassination, at least several of them. Frank Sturgis was Frank Fiorini, in those days. He was interviewed by the FBI as soon as John Kennedy was killed. He was down in Florida. I realized the electoral pattern that had been constantly altered every year. The shooting of Robert Kennedy, the payoff of Hubert Humphrey with Howard Hughes money, the manipulation of Richard Nixon, then the shooting of George Wallace. I had watched that American tapestry through the years, and as soon as they were arrested, I realized that this matter went all the way back to the assassination of John Kennedy and even before. And I sat down, and within 3 weeks, I had written an article for the realist, for Paul Krasner, called Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And we'll go into that a little bit. And it was a 3-part article. The second part was supposed to be called American Assassins Are Mutations. And then the third part was how Nixon really got into power. It was the whole historical overview at that moment in history, June 1972, as I saw it. And this is the way I wrote it, and some of you have the article, some of you don't, but I don't think you'll mind my reading it to you on the tape. It says, the American assassin is a different variety than history has ever produced before. This mongrel is not a pure-breed Nazi, but the deformed and hideous baby produced from the marriage of Nazi General Reinhard Gehlen and his mistress, Allen Dulles of the CIA. It has taken a long time to recognize what is different about this creation, whose birth followed a quickie ceremony immediately after World War II. The parents who helped finance Adolf Hitler's ascendancy, and the agencies still longing for revenge and war against most of mankind, changed their domicile but not their habits. The nursery moved from Germany to the United States and Jamaica, and when the TV cameras turned their lens from the crowd or the hired man photographed holding a weapon, the wide view screen will show the chambers of Washington, New York, Montreal, where the real American assassins shall be properly identified. It says masterminds and experts for many years in illegal rearmament and political assassinations in Germany combined their agents and agencies with the United States. The Gehlen organization was financed by the CIA to the extent of $200 million through Allen Dulles. Families of Eastern Europe, Russia, and Germany, screened by Gehlen, were imported into cities over the United States, particularly in the Southwest. These people still dream of a war against Russia or Asia. A study of their backgrounds reveals why we have wars against Asians, blacks, Chinese, natives, all non-whites taking place today. The emigre group of Russians and Germans was essential to conceal the plot of the assassinations that started November 22, 1963. The object of the American assassinations has been to keep in power the hands of those same people who controlled President Eisenhower and his Vice President Richard Nixon. The murders of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the accident at Chappaquiddick, the shooting of Governor George Wallace were plots to maintain control. Only one candidate gained from all this violence, and that was Richard Nixon and company. I wrote in 1972, the Gehlen Operation, master spy outfit for Hitler's hot war against Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, moved their agents by way of Allen Dulles into the Dallas-Fort Worth-Houston area, where the emigres had large oil and land holdings that were originally taken from their families, and they hoped to return their claims when the Bolsheviks were kicked out. These were members of the Solidarists, the Vaslov's Army of Liberation against the USSR. Nazi war criminals were moved into Texas and the Southwest long before Kennedy was assassinated. George de Mohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's closest friend in Dallas, came from a family where his father was director of the Nobel oil interests in the Minsk province. He was the representative of the landowners to the government of the Tsarist Russia. John J. McCloy, member of the Warren Commission, was the attorney for Rockefeller Standard Oil and represented the refineries of the Nobel family in the Caucasian oil fields that were taken by the Bolsheviks. Conduits of funds for the transfer of emigre groups into the United States from Eastern Europe or Middle East came through the Tolstoy Foundation, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the CIA. When the guns of November 22, 1963 went off, 30 emigre canaries, plus a few Americans connected with Nazi General Walter Dornberger of Bell Aerospace, and Marina Oswald, wife of Lee Harvey Oswald, were singing for the news media and the Warren Commission. There were two profiles of Lee Harvey Oswald, one created by the select group of Texas, Russian, German emigres and government employees, the other put together by other witnesses that showed him to be talented, skilled, disciplined, educated, and a capable person. I wrote in 1972, the 30-year war being waged in the name of peace has been a continuation of experimentations with weapons and oppressions transferred from Germany to the United States. The power to escalate this global conflict became possible by the continuous murder of political candidates who stood up in the way of the war machine mentality. Richard Helms, who was in power in the White House, was a protege of Allen Dulles and Reinhard Gehlen. His agents were used for political assassinations. People like Henry Kissinger, Richard Kleindienst, William Rehnquist, John Connally, Evelyn Younger, and Ronald Reagan were important to this machinery. A section on Nixon and Gehlen, I wrote that the rise of Hitler and fascism in Germany was carefully planned. The elite and illegal rearmament of the covert army was carefully staged after World War I. That's where Gehlen began. Hundreds of political assassinations took place, which I've talked about before. And Richard Nixon was the front man selected to lead this group into the Cold War and to the brink of a hot war, if necessary, using the Gehlen agents. About Nixon, I wrote that the warfare state that was set free in November 22, 1963, began when John Foster Dulles was Secretary of the State from 1953 to 59. His brother Allen Dulles headed the OSS and was in the OSS and then headed the CIA, and they literally ran this government. When Adolf Hitler declared war in 1941, Allen Dulles went over to Switzerland to round up Germans, so when the war was ended, we could use them in the United States. From 1945 to 1952, 642 specialists were brought over here. They were violently anti-communist. They worked with the military and the munitions makers. They were members of the Nazi Party. They were brought here for key positions in universities, factories, aircraft, aerospace. And when Reinhard Gehlen joined forces with our OSS and the CIA, he was back in business and working for the United States. After a series of meetings arranged by the Pentagon with Nazi Gehlen, Allen Dulles, J. Edgar Hoover, and others formed the Gehlen Organization. An espionage network was set up, engaged in clandestine political action to stir revolt, overthrow governments, and bring about political change. Of course, after John Kennedy was murdered, we had the overthrow of Brazil into a police state in Dominican Republic, and all the Latin American countries began to go fascist. And then in that article, after that background on Gehlen, I wrote, enter Richard Nixon, who applied for being in the FBI when he was out of law school. He was a lieutenant commander in the Navy. He was put into a position in Long Island where the Nazis were brought to this country, and later it was confirmed in other books how his office in Whittier was a front for the Nazis. And this article goes into the Cold War, the Alger Hiss story of using a German spy to set up Richard Nixon to frame the peace conferences, the United Nations, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Allen Dulles sent Alger Hiss to all of these meetings and then linked him with a man who later would say that he was a communist. Isaac Don Levine, like Reinhard Gehlen, and Ferenc Nagy is another one of these tapestries that is woven in, as I mentioned before, in the history. These tapestries weave in and out. I wrote in 72, the anniversary 7 years ago, I wrote Isaac Don Levine is the man that took Whittaker Chambers by the arms, a reluctant Chambers, and arranged the meetings that would smear Alger Hiss, and this would catapult Richard Nixon's fight into the Cold War, which is what Gehlen and the agents wanted, by finding a communist in Washington. It was no coincidence that Isaac Don Levine would be meeting with Marina Oswald, the widow of Lee Harvey Oswald, and getting in a huddle to exchange a communist story out of a CIA plot. This is what Levine was doing with Whittaker Chambers. It's what he was doing with Marina Oswald. He worked with the Reinhard Gehlen machinery. That was taken from John J. McCloy's minutes of the Warren Commission meetings on January 21st, 1964. Isaac Levine was getting a communist story out of the CIA plot with Marina Oswald. I also wrote 7 years ago that Richard Nixon, like Adolf Hitler, is a patchwork quilt. Both men represent the sum total of murders, secret plans, behind-the-scene covert imaginations that created their existence. They were hand-sewn and designed by identical masters: Germany, the Nazi Party, the United States military, and the intelligence machine. They are in power today. They continue mass murders, political assassinations. They scrape the bottom of the ocean, the surface of the moon, the face of the earth for oil, gold, minerals, and resources within their grasp. And I wrote, it is the moral obligation of human beings to halt this hunger for power and legalize greed toward the majority of people on planet Earth. And I also wrote that huge summit meetings, a false sense of euphoria preceding elections, does not conceal increased budgets for weapons, new laws for repression, or further concentration in the White House. The SALT talks, the Begin, Sadat talks, the high summit meetings. Don't get your false sense of euphoria worked up about peace. Read your papers every day, like I do, and you'll know that this is a BS cover-up until the big Brahu comes down. I wrote the family of humanity is not represented by the strategists, who are few in number and still hold on to their power. I wrote that in 1972, and I also wrote that Nixon's power in 1972, the week of June 17th, 1972, I was writing this, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And I said Nixon's power over our lives is elusive and vanishes rapidly at the proper moment. The human family has new weapons in the war against secrecy. Information is power. Speed of communication is power. Ability is power. Sheer numbers of intelligent and concerned citizens is power. And facts are power. And of course I predicted that he would be out, that his power was momentary. When you have information, when you have a piece of Scotch tape, a little piece of Scotch tape on a door, a little voice, who knows, deep throat, whether it was Mr. Bennett for the Youth Organization or a group of people. Information, I talked about that last week on the tape by Mr. Vorster being out because a piece of paper can prove that he knew about illegal money that was used to buy up the media to praise South Africa. If we use these tools, we can get them out. But we don't use enough of it, and that's the problem. The solution is there. The fact that it isn't used is bad, because facts are power, and these facts should be put out all the time, such as you're sharing the tapes with me. I'm giving you information, and information can move the worst dogs in the world out if it is spread around. I hope those of you that take these tapes, and I know some of you make copies and then disseminate them to other places, don't misunderstand me. There is no copyright on these. Make it, get it out, disseminate information. Information is power, and it is the kind that even can expose Gehlen. Imagine the news media, the strength of the news media, not having anything about Nagy or Gehlen in your papers. Whatever you find, send to me so we can see how it was covered. But this man changed the whole course of American history without a whisper, just a voice on a radio. Saturday night, or I would not have even known that Reinhard Gehlen is dead. I wrote, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? As I say, I began that just 7 years ago this week. There's a new book out called Martha by Winzola McClendon, Random House. And there's some excerpts of it that were in Ladies' Home Journal. And because it's the anniversary of Watergate and the death of Gehlen and Ferenc Nagy, I think it's timely to bring this up to you. This article, it's an excerpt, as I say, from the book coming out, said that when the Watergate scandal broke, it was Martha Mitchell who first told of the dirty tricks, and it has an interesting background of Martha Mitchell. She graduated at the University of Miami and knew Bibi Rebozo in Florida when she was down in Miami, and this is just the early time when Richard Nixon's career in California, representing the agricultural and the banking and the aerospace industry, is to come to fruit, where he's to run against Jerry Voorhees and become a member of the House of Representatives. And Smathers of Florida, George Smathers, was running and winning and also joining Richard Nixon where they met in Congress. And then Smathers took Nixon down to Florida, where he met Bibi Rebozo, who was carefully linked to the Howard Youth Organization. She knew Bibi Rebozo intimately in Florida. She dated the son of Al Capone, Albert Capone, and this book brings up a subject which I also wrote in Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, that she worked at a chemical warfare service in Washington, D.C. in 1945. In 1957, Martha Mitchell married her second husband. Her first was a Mr. Jennings, Clyde Jennings, but 57 is an important year. That was the year of the Appalachian Conference, where the whole organized crime syndicate was regrouping itself. It's the year that Howard Hughes was never to be seen again from the Beverly Hills bungalow. It was a year of close association of Nixon and Rebozo and the Hughes organization. And in 57, Martha Jennings married John Mitchell. I think that's important because Martha becomes a person who's always in contact with Rebozo, and Mitchell's from New York, from Michigan and New York, and they are soon to all work together. John Mitchell and Richard Nixon knew each other for many years since Nixon started his congressional career. John Mitchell was John Kennedy's commanding officer during World War II. I didn't know that until I read the article. Nixon joined the law office of John Mitchell in New York after he lost the election of governor in California. In 1967, their firms had merged, and within a few weeks, John Mitchell was in charge of the re-election of Richard Nixon in 1968, which involved all the Reichstag tricks that Reinhard Gehlen had used in Germany, the riots in Chicago, the glorification of Richard Nixon. That campaign involved the killing of Robert Kennedy, and Nixon was glorious in his 1968 election victory. Howard Hughes, the same man that put in Nixon, had paid off Hubert Humphrey, and Nixon came home free with John Mitchell managing him. At one point in that year, Martha was put into a psychiatric hospital, Craig House, where she had alcohol, Valium, Librium, and so forth. And later, in 1972, when Watergate comes down, there's a memo that Rebozo says, let's put Martha in the mental hospital. It seems that even though she was a friend of all of theirs and had set up a lot of contacts and meetings, when she knew too much about Watergate, there was a time she had been at B.B. Rebozo's home where they were planning the dirty tricks for 72. 68 was over, as I say, all the riots in Chicago, the hippies, the ancient provocateurs, the paying off of Humphrey, the murdering of Robert Kennedy, again linked to Lockheed and Thane Caesar. In California, the alleged gunman who actually did the shooting that made Nixon's election possible. They were getting ready for the 72 election now, and getting ready again for riots in Miami and the hippies and the counterintelligence, and following the candidates Muskie and Humphrey, and they had on their desk the mental papers, the mental hospital papers of James Eagleton with electric shock, and the dirty trick gang were all back in business again. John Mitchell resigned in March of 72, according to this book, and he was the Attorney General. Martha didn't want him to give up that job, but he had to be in charge of CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. And as soon as he gave up the Attorney General job, he was down at the home of B.B. Rebozo, and along came Jeb Magruder, and a bunch of men arrived, Fred LaRue, Jeb Magruder, and Martha listened on the kitchen intercom, and they were planning their dirty tricks. Dirty tricks. See, Nixon, if he didn't use them to become governor of California, they certainly knew all the Gestapo tricks of killing, of sabotage, of counterintelligence, of leaks, of mental hospitals, the whole bag of tricks that Hitler used to get in 33, they used for Nixon for all of his elections. This book says that a few days after John had resigned, they already knew what tricks they were going to do to get Nixon elected in the next election. By March 1971, Herb Porter was working at CREEP. He was the first person to set up the CREEP office for the 72 elections, left the White House to do that, and he was supposed to work with Martha Mitchell, where she was giving lectures for the Republican Party and so forth, but he was cooking up the dirty tricks on Edmund Muskie. She said, this author says they knew what time he got up, when he went to bed, every single thing that Muskie did, and of course they knew when he was going to be up in New England, and that's when he was given the acid to make him look silly and ridiculous and start to cry, and he didn't become a good candidate because of some chemical that was put into a drink by these dirty trick bastards. And she knew about all of that. Martha Mitchell knew about that. The time George Wallace was shot, I called down to the campaign to speak to them about the kinds of dirty tricks that were going on in May of '72, and his campaign manager said, well, that was impossible. It could be a conspiracy because nobody knew we were going to be at Laurel, Maryland, and the only reason we were there that day was that the glass protector shield that was in front of him was broken and it had to be fixed. The Republicans knew everywhere that George Wallace was, and Hubert Humphrey, and Mr. Eggleton, and Muskie, and all George McGovern. They knew every single thing. They had teams that surveyed them, followed them. And the weekend of June 17th of Watergate, 7 years ago this week, there was a big party in California to get money for the campaign, and out there was Robert Mardian, who was in the Justice Department, John Mitchell, Jeb Magruder, and executives of Gulf Oil who flew them out on their planes. They were at the Beverly Hills Hotel. The evening of the Watergate burglary, John Mitchell was called to the telephone. He didn't tell Martha what happened. And then by Sunday morning, they had moved down to Newport Beach to another hotel. And Martha Mitchell was kept in the company of Steve King and a companion, while John Mitchell went about meeting with other persons, and Patrick Gray was there. Now, in the book, this is the account, not my article on Martha Mitchell, and I hope I have time to show the overlap on it. Martha was lighting a book of matches. It exploded and burned her hand. The doctor who treated it, Dr. McGaughey, is now deceased. He gave her phenopene with codeine to put her to sleep. She tried to find out what was going on. Her husband went back to Washington. She was left with Lee Jablonski and Steve King. She went to the doctor's office for the treatment of the hand, and they talked about the break-in. She was able to get a hold of a paper. She went back to the villa, and she phoned John Mitchell. He wouldn't talk to her. Steve King and Lee kept giving her alcohol. They wouldn't give her food. They talked about the dirty tricks, and she made the mistake of telling them that she knew about the dirty tricks from being in Rebozo's home, and they were the people that were set to guard her. She called her apartment in Washington, and Fred LaRue answered. She called Helen Thomas, that famous call at the UPI. Steve King pulled the phone off the wall. I'm recounting what's in the book about Martha because this was in my article within 3 weeks after she was taken from that hotel in Newport Beach. I wrote, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And I have the account how Steve King ripped the phone off the wall, how Helen Thomas couldn't get back to her, and then she was held down. She went to a balcony, and Steve caught her and pulled her inside. She tried again, and he hit her. Her hand was cut. She went to Dr. Kirkham, and she had 5 or 6 men came, and she was black and blue and beaten up. By the time she got to New York and John saw her, she said he cried that it was a professional job, and she was thoroughly beaten up, black and blue. They gave her a shot to sedate her, a Valium or Stelazine or Thorazine, they can't remember which. The guards held her down. They pulled down her pants. They injected her. They slapped her black and blue, and later she found out it was John who ordered all this. She thought Steve King would be demoted. He was promoted to the agricultural department in the government. Lee Jablonski, who did the assaults along with Steve King, got a good job in the government. She was sent back to New York. She was kept in places where maids didn't speak English. She had very few contacts with the outside world. Her hand had been injured, and she returned to New York with black and blue bruises all over her body, saying she was a political prisoner. In 1972, I wrote, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? I said, the political princess who was once cleared for classified material when she worked in the Army Chemical Corps was suddenly turned into a negligent, selfish mother, and that was the cover story, that she neglected her children. I asked the question immediately after Watergate within days and had it published or in the hands of the printers within 3 weeks. The article was finished in July. I said, did John Mitchell, one of the dirtiest, meanest men in political history, expose his little sweetheart to espionage agents doing some kinds of dirty work and distasteful acts? At what point did Martha have to be removed, silenced, and totally discredited? I asked that 3 weeks after the arrest at Watergate, and then it came out in this book, in the Ladies' Home Journal, and in other information of James McCord that she was, in fact, a political prisoner, that this abuse took place, that she was injected, and it comes out that she sat in the kitchen and heard the talks of the dirty tricks in 1972. She heard them in her apartment. She heard them on the intercom. She had revealed some of it, and it was because she heard them. I said, did he expose his little sweetheart to this espionage to the point where he had to remove her? And he flew back and talked to Richard Nixon, and he knew that they had beat her up, injected her, locked her up, put her with day-old food, nothing but alcohol, in order to make her look discredited. In the article, I wrote what she called to Helen Thomas and said, I'm sick and tired of politics. I gave John an ultimatum I would leave, which she did. I'm a political prisoner. Politics is nothing but cops and robbers' game. I know dirty things. I'm not going to stand for the dirty tricks. I was a patriot until I got assassinated. What country can I go to? This was in my realist article. I'm sick and tired of the whole operation. They threw me down on the bed. 5 men stuck a needle in my arm, my behind. A doctor stitched my fingers after the battle with the guards, and the phone was pulled off the wall. The silencing treatment began. A security agent from the committee to re-elect gave her an injection in her behind. When the doctor stitched up her finger, she had been drugged. The next thing we knew, she was in California. And then I continued to write. Patrick Gray, the head of the FBI, out from the acting head of the FBI from the Justice Department, was staying at the same Newport Hotel where Martha Mitchell was getting this treatment. I wrote then where he shouldn't be investigating this matter. Watergate, he stopped investigations in Los Angeles of various murders and counterintelligence and riots, also patterned after the Reichstag at Isla Vista coming down on the hippies. I wrote 7 years ago about the tragedy of Martha Mitchell, the injections, the isolation. It was confirmed by James McCord. It was confirmed in this new book that's coming out. That is the United States of America. She says she was assassinated. It's interesting she used that word. She received an assassination because 3 years later she died of a rare type of cancer, the kind of cancer that the CIA experimented upon giving people. That also has come out in documents since that time. It's called a Jack Ruby cancer. It's known as Ruby cancer. That's how Martha Mitchell died. Well, good riddance to Ferenc, Nagy, and good riddance to Reinhard, Gehlen, and all their other scumbags. The network they left is their legacy, but at least they're not on this planet, and it's a better place for it, and thank God they're gone.